It's true, 12 years ago when I did give up my previous existence and we sold our land and sold our house, moved on to the farm, very few people thought about halal in a broader context. And in a way, I guess we've been innovators and pioneers in bringing that to sort of the consciousness of people. But I don't want to talk too much about what we do, but I just thought of a very simple presentation. There were some pictures I actually wanted to show in this. I think it's important to recognize that the word halal is not really only to do with the food that we eat. It's a much broader context, and it talks about the productive activities involved in that food production. And that leads to a whole set of choices and actions in what you do, whether you live a halal life. And I think that follows on from what we were just hearing about the need to get involved in networks, to participate in the media, to participate in various actions against global poverty, injustice, etc. So that sort of cumulative effect of your activities is what halal is. And out of that would come a halal life. Just by way of example, I was watching TV yesterday, something I don't often do because I was with my mother in London, and Kate Humble came on the TV and was travelling to Siberia to live with some nomads, which I hadn't come across before, and I thought it was a great example, a very simple, stark example to contrast the way of lives that we should be living and the way of lives that we've been led into living in a very black and white sense. The Nannette people of the Amel Peninsula in northern Siberia have existed conducting simple nomadic lives over 33,000 years. There's evidence of the domestication of dogs and reindeer with seasonal migrations from the tundra plains in the southern Siberia across into the northern frozen Arctic Circle in the summer. How do I move the slides? That's great. So, I mean, you can see some very lovely pictures, just to distract you from me talking very little, showing the sort of migration, the sort of terrain that they live on, the close cooperation with the animals, and how they survive on very meager resources, often grazing just on moss and lichen during the harshest months, and then moving to pastures for the very short summer period. The dogs have an intimate relationship with the people, as well as the reindeers. Movement is on sleds across permafrost land. And seasonally, there's a migration north and then a migration back south. So 2 migrations a year, covering something like 1,000 kilometers. And as you can see, the camps are basic. Once you're inside the tents, there's nothing to see or do except to keep your focus indoors. You can shift from tent to tent to visit your uncle or your other relation. They move in clans and small groups. They rely almost exclusively on their environment, what they obtain from their environment. The poles are gathered from the tundra forests. The reindeer hide produces the skin for the tents. All of the leather work, clothing, straps, twine, everything is obtained from their natural environment. They even use the reindeer guts to make the cotton to sew everything together. So completely dependent on their environment and in tune and in balance with that. They manage the herds to provide that sustainable offtake, but at the same time maintaining the health of the herds, maintaining the health of the range and the pasture that they move over. So they're a perfect example of a group in harmony with their environment. Personally, I've dealt more with more arid environments. In part of my previous existence, I worked in areas in Senegal, working with the Fulani nomads in their migration north and south. And similar things are exhibited in all of these groups, but principally is this respect and awe of nature and a sense of a balance which they maintain. And we mentioned this earlier, someone had mentioned about the need to think where our produce comes from in that short video, I think. And I have a very good friend, Dawood Warnsby, and a brief plug, we're having Dawood visit us in the last week of August to perform on the farm, for those who are interested. Dawood Warnsby is on a personal mission to not buy any new clothes for a period of time. I'm not sure how many years he set himself that task. And in doing so, he's been buying his clothes from second-hand shops, charity shops, but also stitching together a pair of boots that he wore for a ridiculously long period of time, even though there were almost more stitches in them than actual boot left, I think, by the time I met him. So this is an example of where that's a daily existence for the community, but what's happened over the last 40 years, and particularly over the last 10 to 15 years, has been the growth of the gas extraction and oil industry in the region. And as a result, that's led to obviously problems of pollution, but disrupted the migration patterns due to railway lines, pipelines, all other sorts of obstacles, pollution. It's also shortened the migration because the gas companies have been giving payouts of something like £20 a month per family as a way of buying off the local populations. But that then encourages you to enter more and more into a commoditized economy where you're using cash rather than trading, and therefore some of the migrations to the more extreme pastures don't become sensible because you have enough money in your pocket to remain closer to the industrial camps and small villages and towns that are developing. And as a result, you get a whole set of social problems, mass housing projects, various issues that you're probably aware of in other indigenous groups who have been marginalized and incorporated in one way or another into modern economies, whether it's the North American Indians, whether we're talking about nomadic groups across Africa, or in this case in Siberia. I won't go too much into that, but just as a point, one of the major towns in that region, Norilsk, is actually one of the top 10 most polluted towns on Earth. Which is surprising for a relatively small town of only 100,000 people, a mixture of mostly gas workers and employees, construction employees, and the smaller numbers of the Nannette population, which is only 30,000 in the region, that have actually settled in these towns. So to actually achieve that top 10 ranking takes a lot of pollution for a very, very small population. Obviously, most of it caused ancillary to the gas extraction in the region. So you couldn't get a starker contrast really between a traditional respect for nature and the balance of nature and this self-reliance and reliance on the environment to provide all of our needs, and the plundering, commodifying nature of what we can call capitalism, but ultimately what we can more simply call just human greed and desire to control, as again was referred to, this desire to control power networks in the media. So very simply contrasted, and as the video brought out from MAID, it was showing that each of the items we consume in some way are connected into those networks. So whilst we can look at this and see the contrast and say, well, yes, clearly that's bad, what we're not looking at is how we're impacting on the world, and much of what we're doing is actually feeding into that. Many of us might well actually be burning natural gas that came from Russia, came from this region, in our own homes, or in other ways consuming some of those resources. The Nannette Cosmology is quite interesting in this program, and I did a little bit of reading afterwards. It's essentially described as a shamanistic belief, but at the very heart of it, like we find in many of the early religions, it's based on a concept of a creative force, a power which has left the earth, bequeathed the earth to them in a trust, and that the spirit of that creative force imbues all of the aspects of the creation. So within nature itself, whether it's within the forest, the tundra, the grassland, whether it's within the reindeer or the animals, the Nannette regard all of them as carrying a spark of God, the ruh of God, the breath of God within them. And therefore respect for them, respect for those spirits, and the desire to not offend the spirit of nature, the spirit of the animals, is essentially a way of maintaining a balance and respecting God's creation. That's not too different from the sort of thing I talk about with Islam. I mean, ultimately, we know that Allah is beyond our conception, as we know in the surah, Bismillahir-Rahmanir-Rahim, Qul huwallahu ahad, Allahu samad, lam yalid wa lam yulad wa lam yakun lahu kufuwan ahad. He has no likeness of which we can even conceive of in our heads, so we can't try. We can't approach God through an understanding of Him. But how does Allah direct us to understand Him but through His Spirit in nature? Throughout the Quran, we're reminded to look for God through the signs in the creation around us. But more importantly, the very simple concept in Islam is that after the fall from the garden, man was placed on earth, but placed on earth with a difference between us and the rest of creation, essentially free will. We have the choice to act in accordance with God's nature, in accordance with our fitra, or we have the ability to go against that and act in a way that is destructive. So we can be the highest of all creation, but we can also render ourselves the lowest of the low. We have the free will to choose what we do. So clearly we should be far closer to the Nannette in terms of the spirit of their belief, that we are here as stewards to take care of God's creation. But in practice, we're all far closer to the gas corporations that are extracting resources across the world, because we are wearing, eating, drinking, and using those resources that are being produced for us. The key point I like to stress is that this comes down to a separation from nature. What we've found is that we are being removed from that responsibility. If khilafah means anything, it doesn't mean a bunch of guys running around Syria in silly turbans. It's more to do with responsibility and stewardship of God's creation. Yeah? It's less to do with ritual and what we say and what our aqidah might well be, but much more to do with our actions. And as I often quote a very important hadith of the Prophet, very simple and straightforward, ad-din mu'amala. Our religion is how we act, our actions, our social interactions. Mu'amala means this sense of acting in community with other people. So it's how we act as a group, as an individual, but an individual within that group, that actually gives us value. And that is the whole purpose. That is our spiritual journey to return from that natural fitra state, to return to the garden. And our test on earth is how we actually discharge that as individuals, and collectively we see the impact. Unfortunately, as I say, we're closer to the corporations. Most of you are eating these today, possibly tomorrow, but you'll be eating chickens that are reared in industrial sheds, hundreds upon hundreds of thousands of birds produced. And as Muslims, we actually have this horrible label that we are the largest meat consumers in England, proportionally. Muslims eat more meat than the other communities in the UK, which is pretty shocking. We also, of course, devour the renewable energy sources, whether it's the gas or it's the oil. Very hard to get away from that. As the video pointed out, our cars, motorized transport is probably the largest producer of pollution. And I'm not exempt. I have a tractor that occasionally works. And then thirdly, the waste products that we produce. A lovely sign there, contaminated water, ocean water may cause illness, keep out, keep off the beaches. We often don't think, but the water you're drinking is then returned back into the sewage system, it returns back into the River Thames, it's treated, and it comes back to you to drink. The whole process goes on and on. Pollution is something we're causing around us all day and every day with the waste that we produce, but also the plastics we use and abuse around us in every shape and form. I don't really need to go into that, I'm sure it's something you're all aware of. But our religion should be how we act. Our deen is mu'amala. It should be what we're doing in this world. I don't want to sort of make everyone feel guilty, and I certainly don't want to come across as if I'm in any way better. I could list to you the aspects of interaction with the modern world which I still have not escaped on the farm. I'll tell you a little bit about what we've done, and we're very proud of what we have done. But I think more important than making you feel guilty is just to make you aware that what you're doing through networks such as MADE is brilliant. What we've heard today already about the sort of things you can get involved in. If you're studying as a lawyer, go and work for human rights. If you're studying as an architect, build something beautiful and natural, something that's holistic. Whatever field you're working in, you can do what you can do. Personally, I'm not optimistic. In fact, I think the optimism about changing the media, I would criticize, but I probably shouldn't do it here too much. But I think we've seen the Arab Spring, we've seen the ability to manipulate and co-opt social media, we've seen actually, in a sense, a master plan to subvert the Arab Spring through the use of social media. So I'm not particularly optimistic, but I do try and tell people, are we here as Muslims to save the world, or are we here to save ourselves? Ultimately, it might well be God's plan, and it probably is God's plan, that we will in some shape or form reach an environmental crisis, which will reflect the moral crisis that we're going through as humans. I don't think that's really the case. If you're here to save the world, you'll probably get very depressed. But if you're here to save yourselves and work as communities and draw immense joy from working in those communities and groups and realizing that you, through your own actions, are helping others and making some form of change in this world, at least within the circles that you affect, great. If instead you sit and watch Al Jazeera all night and think about the terrible wars across the Muslim world and get hyped up about the politics, you'll probably end up a very angry young man or woman. So I think far more important to have social action at home. The old phrase, think global, act local, is very true to me, and partly that's what informed my departure from some of the international work I'd done, where I'd seen very slow pace of change, a lot of political and powerful networks co-opting and subverting grassroots change. Flat networks are great in terms of a talk, in terms of actually meaning anything. I'd leave that to one side personally, because I think it's very easy to be subverted, very easy for well-meaning groups to set up institutions and then be co-opted into those networks themselves. And that's the nature of man, the nature of humanity. What's really important, I think, is that ability to actually trace your relationship to what you do. So in terms of the food you consume, and this is where I'm coming from, the fact that you can wander into your halal shop, or you can go to a clothes shop and buy your Nike shoes, or you can go somewhere where you're actually immune to the real responsibility for the actions that produced it. I think that's what we need to change in our personal lives. You need to say, well, how can I address these questions? How can I find out where this comes from? How can I actually find sources which I can hand on heart say this has been done in a fair trade manner, this has been produced ethically. And in that regard, welcome to Willowbrook Farm. Open only on Sunday afternoons for the farm shop, but available for orders and deliveries around the country. No, I'm just joking. I mean, one part of what we do is we produce ethical halal and tayyib meat. That was, in a sense, the start of what we did. It wasn't the raison d'etre for what we did. The reason we set up was, in fact, to change our own lifestyles and to feel that we were living in harmony with our environment. And as a result of that, we looked for ways to establish the farm. But we've done a lot more than just producing the meat. In addition to that, we've been busy over the last 4 years building an eco-home, which is a very large, almost palatial mud building built of clay, sand and straw. Essentially all the materials in building that came from the local environment. If it were knocked down and returned to the soil, it would actually have almost a zero footprint. But more importantly, it was built as part of a community effort. A lot of people got involved in that. We controlled the production and the building throughout the whole process, from the design to the actual building of it. And that's very important to reduce our reliance on just being told what to do, just having buildings built for us, materials brought in which are produced across the world with various impacts. In addition to that, we've actually installed a biomass boiler. I haven't got a picture of it there because I couldn't find any pictures at the moment, but you can see the fuel that we use being stored up for the winter. We have a very large biomass boiler that provides all of the heating and energy for hot water, radiators, etc. across the farm, and that's all produced using timber. In addition to that, we've actually planted about 6,000 trees across the farm, which provides us a sustainable source of timber, hopefully into the future. So again, reasonably independent for our needs for heating. And in addition, again, there's no picture there, we built a second building which has 5 kilowatts of electrical production from solar panels and wind turbines, so producing almost 2/3 of our electricity needs. We've also put in a very large sewage treatment plant on the farm just recently, which again is treating all of the waste on the farm and returning that back as pure water or as compostable material. That's in addition to the very small compost toilets that some of you may know of. We've now upgraded to the very large sewage treatment plant that actually treats the rest of our waste. So in a sense, we've tried to tackle all these aspects of what we do so that we can pass on that information and we can at least let people see that there are ways to do this. It's not necessarily going to make us a lot of money over the years. We're living comfortably, but at the same time, we know that we are taking responsibility for those aspects of our lives. And we hope that through education and extension, this is something we can pass on. So the most important thing that we feel that we do on the farm is connecting to the customers that come to us and the large number of visitors that come for some of the open days we've run. And we encourage you to look at what we're doing and take responsibility for your own actions in that regard. So a small, only a small effort really in a way, but it's part of enabling you to see where you can make changes in your own lives so that you can actually take responsibility for the decisions that are made for you on the global stage, often without you being aware of it. I think that's all I wanted to say. So if there's still 5 minutes left, maybe we could just take any questions really. And if you want to know more about us, look on our website or come and visit us on the farm. Thank you.
So if there's just a couple of minutes, I just wanted to ask
Sure.
one question. So this is something I've heard you speak about before, but just for our benefit, often we're in situations where we feel like we don't really have a choice in the food that we eat, and that it might be potentially inconvenient or very difficult to actually get organic meat in the place that we are. And then for lots of the other Muslim community, you might find that it's financially extremely difficult for them to actually make that commitment. I wanted to ask what your suggestion is for a Muslim who wants to live an ethical, a wholesome life, ensuring that they're abiding by animal welfare standards and all those kinds of things that Islam teaches us to uphold, yet for many people it just might not seem like a realistic life choice.
Yeah, I guess so. It's a difficult one to answer. I guess you've got to prioritize something in your life to decide what is important to you, because it's not just your food, it's also the clothes that you're wearing, it's so many aspects of your life. There's a lot you can do with waste. I mean, you can do something, at least it seems pointless, but do a certain amount of recycling and composting and finding ways to minimize your packaging and waste. Buying bags for life or whatever. I know these things are very small, but you can do those things that don't cost you anything. So the areas that don't cost you, well then what excuse do you have? As for buying good quality, halal, ethical, welfare-friendly food, because it's inconvenient, you can't manage, I think we need to sort of maybe question the convenience. Convenience is bad. It shouldn't be so convenient. You should have to make a bit of an effort. In terms of the volume of consumption, maybe consider reducing the volume. As Muslim cultures from diverse parts of the Asian subcontinent and the Middle East, we have a lot of very healthy foods, lentils and rice. Eat that 4 or 5 times a week rather than meat so regularly. So I can only suggest you cut down, but also cook differently, cook less meat in your meals, and also when you're buying the sort of quality meat we produce, it doesn't disappear on the plate. So I would argue that it's always actually not always as expensive as it seems. I think there are ways to make quality meat and quality food last longer. I mean, some customers who are not that well off buy the chicken carcasses from us only, and then they manage to make stocks and soups, and it's amazing, how far that will go. So there are ways to adapt your lifestyle to a more halal, acceptable way. Ultimately, what are you asking me? Is it okay to carry on buying rubbish? It's not, but how far are we going to go to change it? Well, we've got to change it slowly and as we can. We're not completely clear of a lot of impacts. We use a diesel tractor, we still use a vehicle. So there are things we do which we're still thinking long term how to change them. So start at basics, change what's easy to change, and then build up from that. But change your diets. We have the worst diet in all the communities in England. Yeah.
So then just lastly, if anyone's interested in buying from Willowbrook Farm, how would one go about doing that?
Well, just look on the website. I leave that to my son Khalil, so he deals with that side of things. But more importantly, I think if you want to learn more about what we're doing and how we do it, this was very, very short, and I apologize for not really having put a lot of information in there, but I know the time was short. If you really want to know what we do on the farm, come and visit us, come and see, and we're always changing, always doing more things. We've just had a community orchard of 1 acre of about 120 fruit trees planted by members of the community coming and getting involved in doing that. So there's always things to get involved in on the farm.